now for a night in my inn.
Hype the Time Quest could be considered a forgotten gem, a true diamond in the rough. Developed by Ubisoft Montreal and released in North America in 1999 for PC and 2001 for the Game Boy Color, it has been billed as an adventure video game, although it does bear a striking resemblance to what would later become known as the action RPG genre. Slash, shoot, or magic your way through the lands of, well, the name of the kingdom is, in fact, never mentioned, but that shan't bother us. Let me recap the story in brief. You are the knight Hype, whose bride-to-be Vibe is kidnapped by the evil Black Knight Barnack, who aspires to imprison your rightful liege, Tascan IV, and usurp his throne. As his most trusted bodyguard, it is on you to stop him, but Barnack puts a spell on you, turning you into stone and sending you back in time by 200 years. As you can probably already tell, Hype is quite a prophetic game. Despite stemming from the turn of the millennium, it has accurately predicted what will undoubtedly become the most popular boys and girls name once Gen Z does, in fact, start having children, if ever. The plot might also sound somewhat familiar to you. Girl meets boy, boy is subdued by evil overlord, girl subsequently kidnapped. Get it yet? Well, let's just say The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was all the rage back then, and leave it at that. Some say the copyright lawsuit has been filed but is still pending, lost in time. With you, the protector of the kingdom, out of the way, the Black Knight seems to have succeeded in his plans. But something unforeseen happens as Hype is awoken from his slumber by an aspiring magician in the era of Tascan I, the reign of what would probably be the great-great-grandfather of Hype's actual king. This leaves you, the player, with ample time to turn back time and undo what happened, for which reason you must travel back to the future through 4 distinct eras. Kind of confusing, I know. Believe me, it's been quite a trip trying to wrap my head around this narrative and make it digestible for you. Either way, depetrified, you set out on a quest through time to stop the Black Knight by any means necessary. It's probably obvious to you by now that Hype the Time Quest is a Playmobil interactive game, part of a series of games released around the turn of the millennium, all of which were produced by Ubisoft, that are aimed at a younger audience, presumably around 6 to 12 years old. That might be quite surprising, seeing as the game is without a doubt too hard for kids that age. How do I know that, you ask? Well, I've had the pleasure of exploring the world of Hyrule, the lands of Tuscany, if you will, sitting on my stepfather's lap at the wee age of 4. Let me tell you, parental guidance or not, it's been quite a chore trying to finish that game. I vividly remember being stuck in the first age, unable to progress at a certain point, because we literally had no idea where to go or what to do. It took us months, yes, months of playing every now and then, trying to progress. We scoured every edge of the world that was accessible at that point, talked to each NPC countless times, and it was all for naught. Mind you, this was before the internet was bustling with tutorials, walkthroughs, and the like, and I myself couldn't even read. Back then, we had to work hard for our progress, and we were better for it. Nah, I'm just kidding. In reality, well, mainly my stepfather, as I was quite illiterate at that point in time, mailed Ubisoft, and the absolute legend of a customer service representative was kind enough to send a complete walkthrough our way that I believe their game testers used internally, with which we were finally able to progress. Knowing where to go and what to do is only half the battle, though. The game's difficulty curve can't be described as such. Most parts are quite easy, smooth sailing you might say, but at some points it would spike, most notably during some, though not all, of the game's boss fights, of which there are plenty. I remember Hype not only being my first action RPG, it is also most certainly the first Dark Souls game I have ever played. Saving is done by a system of bookstands with which you can interact, scattered about the game world. That too contributes to frustrations, as not all save points are directly before a boss. Each boss has different mechanics, though ultimately it all boils down to not getting hit and hitting them in turn, the age-old, monumentally exciting foundation upon which all good action RPGs are built, except for those few fights where not getting hit is not really an option, forcing you to stock up on potions and coming prepared, thus artificially and, for modern gamers' tastes, perhaps annoyingly, increasing the difficulty. As you might be able to tell at this point, the game is not without its grievances, but as someone who plays retro games regularly, that is kinda to be expected. What they did get right, however, is the game world. As ridiculous as that may sound in a digital rendition of what a children's room might have looked like in the early 2000s, complete with faithful recreations of then popular Playmobil figures and even physically available props and set dressings such as castles, the world is more believable than what some AAA developers cook up for us these days. I guess this is as good a time as any to talk about the map. It consists of a couple of distinct areas which are being reused throughout the game as you progress through the different eras. Most prominently, the Magician's Tower, where you awake from your slumber, the forest, the monastery, and the city of Taurus, as well as a sky section, which includes a little mini-game that you have to complete at the end of each era in order to progress. The world itself isn't particularly huge. You could run from one end to the other in about 5 minutes probably, maybe less, but it uses the same kind of magic that Gothic 1 and 2 employ in order to make it seem bigger. It is filled to the brim with nooks and crannies that you can explore and which might or might not hold secrets. On top of that, the location of NPCs and items changes through the eras, and the city of Taurus is being expanded upon from each age to the next, giving you some extra locations the further into the game you progress. The attitude and demeanor of the people around you changes depending on which era you visit. So does the sovereign's attitude to strangers, or to the vehicles of progress, if you will, science and magic. Tascan II is known as a friend of the sciences, even going so far as to sponsor magicians. Tascan III, in turn, has them locked away in their quarter after they had grown too powerful for his liking. The way that you travel through time is never linear. Sometimes the story requires you to backtrack in order to talk to someone you have already met in the past, but whose disposition towards you will have shifted. The brigands, for example, who stalk the forest and waylay our brave knight in the era of Tascan I, end up revering Hype as an almost godlike figure by the Third Era. And they turn into what will be the Resistance by the time of the Fourth Era. There is continuity in its NPCs. The quest of a master shoemaker and his son, whom you meet in the first chapter to devise the ultimate running shoes, is brought to fruition in the era of Tascan III, the son being an old man at that point and his father long since having passed away. This quest is implemented by a string of mini-games which have you race the clock in different locations and eras and reward you with the shoes that make you run like lightning, a handy gadget to have considering the amount of backtracking you will be doing. The races are also your main way of farming gold if that does end up becoming necessary towards the latter stages of the game, when being hit in boss fights is sometimes all but guaranteed. A frustrating circumstance that saps both your health and your finances. Money in this game is, by the way, only used to buy consumables, so it has to be viewed as an extension of your health bar by and large. As time passes, so do the people. Thus, the shopkeepers change names, adapt new slogans and marketing techniques. You might be amused to find each blacksmith having a different rhyme on offer when you first visit him. And one of them is loving the fact there's a civil war on, totally thrilled by his ever-increasing war profiteering. What's also quite hilarious is that Hype has succeeded in familiarizing preteens with the concepts of inflation. Plastics, the game's main currency by the way, I suppose the Tuscanian maritime life is way beyond saving at this point, seems to be worth progressively less as you travel back to your own time. A simple meal in the inn during the time of Tascan I costs you roughly 50 plastics. By the time you reach the Civil War era of Tascan III, the price for the very same meal that has exactly the same effects, that being restoring your health to full, will have increased to 150 plastics. Pretty crazy, right? Good thing we can just hop back on the old sundial and let the good times roll, as they say. Sure wish I could get me a nice and cheap 80s Big Mac. From a game mechanics standpoint, I'm not quite sure why the increased prices on the same items the further you progress, as there's a sundial right outside the only shop in the game, which makes this a little bit redundant, at least from a balancing standpoint. It takes but a few seconds to zip through time and buy what you like, when you like it. As the meals go up in price, so do the consumables, for the most part. Red potions go up in price the further you progress. Weirdly though, the same cannot be said for blue potions, which are the entry-level potions and the weakest counterpart. Those are cheapest in the third era. I realize none of you will be playing this game most likely, but I'd still like to include the fun fact that blue potions are the best bang for your buck, as long as you buy them in the third era, that is. Blue potions heal about half the amount a red potion does, but only cost a third. Quick maths tells me that that's the most efficient potion there is. Well, there it is, min-maxing a game for kids, and before you ask, no, I'm not ashamed. While on that topic, the flight minigame upon which I have briefly touched earlier has you collect diamonds in the sky or something and raise a timer doing it. After you've collected all of them, the timer disappears, but instead you will become hunted by dragons. It is possible to cheese this and skip the dogfight part, at least in the first and second era, by simply not collecting one of the first diamonds you come across and turning around after you're only missing one more, collecting the one you left at the beginning last and zoning out immediately after. Not that flying is really hard or anything, the plasticky dragon sound effects just give me the heebie-jeebies, and the sky level for some reason feels as eerie to me as some out-of-bounds areas in other games. So I was quite relieved to find I could circumvent that a little bit. Now, I did say at the beginning the game was hard, but probably not by today's standards. For the purpose of recording this video, I sat down to play it on an afternoon, and I was able to beat it in about 8 hours without dying too often, and when I did, it was more due to a lack of concentration and a result of overconfidence than true difficulty. Then again, it is my third time playing through it, so a little bit of a learning curve is to be expected. I won't sit here and tell you that the gameplay in and of itself is thrilling, and it certainly hasn't reinvented the wheel, neither in terms of story, Zelda says hello, nor in terms of mechanics. Even back then, Ubisoft has already played it pretty safe. Looking at you, Far Cry and Assassin's Creed, what is remarkable though is the fact that every single NPC in the game, no matter how unremarkable, and there are a couple of non-essential ones, are fully voice acted. The employed accents range from believable to utterly outrageous, and the quality of the voice work is quite shaky at times, but I still have to commend them for this effort. Mind you, games like Morrowind, which also released in 2001, lack voice acting for the most part. It had by no means become an industry staple at that point. Sometimes the voice acting, as well as the writing and dialogues, is above average. At one point during the first era, when hype is captured in the throne room of Tascan I, the game takes an almost Monty Python-esque tone, something that undoubtedly would have been lost on my preschool self, but which I can appreciate even more nowadays. Playing hype as an adult kind of feels like watching SpongeBob or The Simpsons. It's not entirely without its charm, the tongue-in-cheek humor written by adults undoubtedly for adults, doing at least a small part to alleviate the mental stresses of playing a literal Playmobil video game as a grown-ass man. There is no real room for character improvement. As I said, you can't spend your plastics on anything but consumables. You can, however, complete minigames that let you increase the maximum amount of consumables carried. What would a good Ubisoft game be without collectibles? You have the option of finding and shooting down beehives scattered throughout the eras, which upgrade your inventory capacity. Another thing upgradable is your magic repertoire, consisting of 3 different schools: fire, frost, and lightning. Most of them are single target. There is, however, one spell that is totally overpowered, that being the shockwave spell, which sends out an AoE lightning that stuns and damages enemies in a circle around you. Plus, you are immune while casting, This lets you mop up most enemy groups without too much issue. Two bad bosses are for the most part immune to magic though, and as cool and exciting as the spell system might seem for a game this old, I really only ended up using that one spell, except for when I had to put out fires with the Ice Bolt, which you will sometimes be required to do in order to progress the story. Neat idea though, quite reminiscent of how elements worked in Bioshock 2 or Divinity Original Sin. You also, by the way, cannot block. This makes avoiding damage even harder. You have the option of jumping, sidestepping, or dodging backwards in order to not get hit. I guess this is as good a time as any to mention that, as most first and third person games of the 90s, there is no mouse control. You control your character using the arrow keys and have two extra keys for strafing. The upside is that you can configure the game to basically play it one-handed. Great if you want to have one hand free to pet your cat or whatever. Speaking of cats, an honorable mention has to go out to those two, as they are represented in almost every era and serve absolutely no purpose whatsoever. So the developers got that right at the very least. You can't even pet them, really. 10 out of 10 realism. Now, I'm not sure why, but aiming and moving in general felt super weird playing through the game. Maybe it has to do with my emulator that I'm using this time around, or that my screen has a weird refresh rate the game can't handle, or that I'm using a mechanical keyboard, but the inputs feel really iffy at times, and I definitely had to be patient to get through some of the jump puzzles or to hit some of the beehives using the keyboard aim. That is not something that I remember playing through it years ago. I replayed it the second time when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I think, but it was definitely noticeable this time around. Even though there are black bars on the video, a fact for which I deeply apologize, by the way, I would still consider the graphics to be holding up for the most part. It sort of feels like diving into WoW Classic, a somewhat comparable but definitely not similar cartoonish style makes the games visually bearable far beyond their expected shelf life. Is Hype the Time Quest worth playing? Maybe, if you could pick it up on Steam or somewhere else and just plug and play. I had to go through a little bit of a hassle to get it to run on Windows 10, and while it was worth it to me because I was just too curious how I would look at it 16 years after playing it, you might feel differently, probably never having played it before. And if you're not really keen on older games, then I probably have to advise you to steer away from it, as much as it pains me to say. If you do consider yourself a little bit of a digital archaeologist, then by all means go ahead and try it. There are a couple of tutorials out there on how to get it to run, and if you're not nearly as inept as I am when it comes to handling a PC, it will probably take you just a couple of minutes. If you are as inept as me, however, then I would be glad to lend a hand. Just let me know and I will try to help out. Don't forget though that you might want to get your hands on an original copy of the game first. Well, there you have it. This is my recap of the first action RPG that I have ever played, and the first video I've ever made. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I certainly had a blast recording and putting this thing together. I do realize that it's quite rough around the edges, but I hope that you still had fun, and I'll be sure to improve as I go along. If there are any games that you would like to see covered, be they retro or not, don't hesitate to reach out. I would be very glad for feedback and constructive criticism. Have a great day.